There is a waterway on this planet so strategically critical that its closure is shaking the foundations of the global economy. It is 33 kilometers wide at its narrowest point, a strip of water connecting the Persian Gulf to the Gulf of Oman and the Arabian Sea. And through it, every single day, flows approximately 20% of the world's entire oil supply and 25% of the world's liquefied natural gas. It is called the Strait of Hormuz, and right now it is the most dangerous body of water on Earth. On the morning of May 8, 2026, the United States Navy fired on and disabled 2 Iranian-flagged oil tankers attempting to circumvent the ongoing American naval blockade of Iran. Hours earlier, 3 U.S. Navy destroyers, the USS Truxtun, the USS Rafael Peralta, and the USS Mason, were targeted by Iranian forces using missiles, drones, and fast attack boats in the Strait of Hormuz. U.S. Central Command responded by striking the Iranian military facilities it identified as responsible for those attacks. Iran called the American blockade an act of war. The United States called its own military action defensive. And President Trump told NBC News the ceasefire was still in effect. Meanwhile, the world waits for Iran's response to a 14-point peace proposal that could either end this conflict or detonate it. I have spent this week going through verified intelligence assessments, institutional economic analyses, diplomatic records, and military operational data on this conflict. What I've found is a crisis far larger and far more consequential than most of its coverage has conveyed. This is not just a war between the United States and Iran. This is a conflict that has already removed 20% of the world's oil supply from the market, put $3.5 trillion of global GDP at risk, and placed the entire international trading system in a state of acute fragility, while 2 of the world's most unpredictable governments try to negotiate through a ceasefire that neither side fully believes in. Welcome to Global Faultlines. I am your correspondent. And this is the story the headlines are not big enough to contain. To understand where we are today, you need to understand exactly how we got here, because this conflict did not begin with naval standoffs or oil tankers. It began before dawn on February 28, 2026. On that morning, the United States and Israel launched a coordinated series of surprise airstrikes on Iran, targeting military sites, government facilities, nuclear infrastructure, and senior officials. Among those killed in those opening strikes was Ali Khamenei, Iran's supreme leader of 36 years. Multiple senior Iranian military commanders and government officials were also killed in the opening salvo. This was not a limited strike. This was a decapitation operation against the leadership of a nation-state. Iran's response was immediate. It launched missile and drone strikes on Israel, on U.S. military bases across the region, and on U.S. allied Arab nations. And it closed the Strait of Hormuz. The implications of that single action were staggering. Before the conflict began, more than 20 million barrels of oil passed through the strait every day. Crude oil, refined products, and liquefied natural gas from Saudi Arabia, Iraq, Kuwait, the UAE, Qatar, and Bahrain, heading primarily to Asian markets. By early March 2026, that flow had been reduced to approximately 3.8 million barrels per day, according to the International Energy Agency's April 2026 oil market report. The IEA took the unprecedented step of releasing 400 million barrels of oil from strategic reserves, one of the largest emergency reserve releases in history, to cushion the shock. Oil prices responded immediately. Brent crude futures climbed toward $97 per barrel on expectations of eventual resolution. The physical market, the actual price that Asian and Middle Eastern importers pay for delivered crude, reached $132 per barrel. The Dallas Federal Reserve Bank estimated that the closure was on track to push West Texas Intermediate crude to $98 per barrel on average and reduce global GDP growth by 2.9 percentage points on an annualized basis. The Kiel Institute for the World Economy calculated that the closure of the strait had already driven global energy prices up 5.4% and food prices up 2.7%. with the most severe impacts falling on energy-dependent developing nations in South Asia, Sub-Saharan Africa, and the broader Middle East. Jordan and Lebanon, both almost entirely dependent on Gulf crude imports, faced near total exposure. South Korea and India faced welfare losses projected at 1.4 to 2.5% of GDP. According to Solability's economic modeling, the conflict, even under a fragile or partial ceasefire scenario, already has approximately $3.57 trillion of global GDP at risk. Under a prolonged closure scenario, that number rises to $4.81 trillion. This is the economic weight behind the naval standoffs in the Strait. Now let us examine the military and diplomatic picture, because the situation on the water is as complex as the situation at the negotiating table. On April 13, 2026, the United States imposed a formal naval blockade of Iran, announced by Trump and implemented under the command of Admiral Brad Cooper at U.S. Central Command. The blockade applies to all ships traveling to or from Iranian ports and coastal areas. According to CENTCOM, any vessel entering or departing the blockaded area without authorization is subject to interception, diversion, and capture. Since the blockade took effect, the U.S. has intercepted at least 23 vessels. At least 26 ships managed to bypass the blockade line in both directions, according to Lloyd's List. 2 Iranian-flagged oil tankers were disabled on the morning of May 8th alone, after attempting to move past the blockade. The U.S. currently has more than 20 warships and 15,000 service members deployed in the Middle East. That represents one of the largest American naval deployments to the region since the Gulf War. But here is the strategic tension that most coverage has failed to properly explain. The U.S. is running 2 simultaneous and potentially contradictory operations in the same body of water. It is enforcing a naval blockade, an act that Iran's Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi has explicitly called an act of war. And it is simultaneously pursuing a diplomatic settlement through Pakistani intermediaries under a fragile ceasefire framework that neither side fully acknowledges and both sides are actively violating. Secretary of State Marco Rubio has described the latest military action as separate and distinct from the original Operation Epic Fury, the February campaign that launched the war. Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth announced Project Freedom, a U.S.-led operation to guide commercial shipping through the Strait, calling it defensive in nature, focused in scope, and temporary in duration. Iran's response has been to say it will view any U.S. military vessel near the Strait as a breach of the ceasefire and will respond accordingly. This is the environment in which 14 American warships are currently operating. Let us talk about the diplomatic picture, because it is here that the most consequential decisions of this conflict are now being made. The United States sent Iran a 14-point peace proposal earlier this week. The terms, reported by multiple outlets including Al Jazeera and confirmed by U.S. officials, are as follows. Iran must agree not to develop a nuclear weapon. It must halt all uranium enrichment for a minimum of 12 years. It must hand over its current stockpile, approximately 440 kilograms of uranium enriched to 60% purity. For context, the threshold for weapons-grade uranium is 90% enrichment. Iran's stockpile is not yet weapons-grade, but it is the largest stockpile of highly enriched uranium Iran has ever possessed, and the IAEA reported in December 2024 that Iran had the technical capacity to produce enough fissile material for multiple nuclear weapons on short notice. In exchange for compliance, the United States would gradually lift economic sanctions, release billions of dollars in frozen Iranian assets, and withdraw the naval blockade. Both sides would reopen the Strait of Hormuz within 30 days of signing. Iran's position, stated repeatedly through its foreign minister and through its negotiating delegation in Islamabad, is that its nuclear enrichment program is non-negotiable. Iran says it will not surrender the right to enrich uranium as a signatory to the Non-Proliferation Treaty. Iran has also demanded that Lebanon be included in any ceasefire agreement, a condition the U.S. has rejected because Lebanon's situation involves Hezbollah, which the U.S. refuses to include in the Iran deal framework. The Islamabad talks of April 11th and 12th, the highest-level direct discussions between the U.S. and Iran since the 1979 Islamic Revolution, lasted 21 hours and ended without agreement. J.D. Vance announced on departure that Iran had refused to accept our terms. Iran's delegation said trust had not been established. Trump, in the hours following, said he no longer cared about negotiations. He then announced the naval blockade. This is the diplomatic backdrop against which the U.S. is now firing on Iranian oil tankers in the Strait of Hormuz, while simultaneously waiting for Iran's formal written response to its 14-point proposal. As Al Jazeera's correspondent reporting from Tehran noted this week, despite the back and forth in these military confrontations, diplomatic and mediation efforts still appear to be underway. Both sides appear to remain interested in some form of diplomatic engagement, even as their military forces exchange fire in the same waterway. There is a leadership vacuum at the center of this conflict that has received almost no coverage, and it matters enormously for how this crisis resolves. Ali Khamenei, Iran's supreme leader, was killed in the opening U.S.-Israeli strikes on February 28th. His son, Mojtaba Khamenei, has not been seen publicly since sustaining serious injuries in those same attacks. U.S. intelligence, according to CNN, assesses that Mojtaba Khamenei is likely helping direct Iran's war strategy and its approach to negotiations. But that precise authority within what one official described as a fractured regime remains unclear. Iran is fighting a war, navigating complex nuclear negotiations, managing a naval standoff with the world's most powerful military, and doing all of this without a clearly established supreme leader. The formal leadership structure of the Iranian state has been fundamentally disrupted. Decisions are being made by a collection of senior officials, military commanders, and parliamentary figures whose internal authority relationships are not fully understood by Western intelligence. This is not a minor detail. When you are trying to negotiate a 14-point peace agreement with a country, it matters enormously whether the person you are negotiating with has the authority to actually implement what they agree to. Now let us zoom out to the global strategic picture, because this is what Global Faultlines exists to surface. This conflict is not simply a bilateral confrontation between Washington and Tehran. It is reshaping the global power landscape in real time. Russia, as reported by The Economist and confirmed by multiple intelligence sources, has been providing Iran with specific tactical advice on drone warfare, drawn directly from Russia's 4 years of experience attacking Ukraine. The techniques being shared include coordinated wave attacks using multiple drone types simultaneously to overwhelm Western air defense systems. This means that the same tactics Russia developed and refined in the skies above Ukrainian cities are now being adapted for use against U.S. military assets in the Persian Gulf. China's foreign minister met with Iran's Iraqi in Beijing this week. The U.S. has directly called on China to use that meeting to pressure Iran toward a diplomatic resolution, specifically asking Beijing to tell Tehran that continued hostility in the Strait will result in Iran being globally isolated, in the words of Secretary Rubio. China has not publicly committed to applying that pressure. The United Kingdom, Australia, France, and the European Union have all declined to support the U.S. naval blockade, instead promoting a multinational maritime mission framework as an alternative approach. Spain's defense minister described the blockade as making no sense. This is a significant fracture within the Western alliance. Different NATO members and close U.S. allies openly rejecting a core element of Washington's strategy in the region. And then there is the nuclear question, the one that sits beneath every other dimension of this conflict. Iran has 440 kilograms of uranium enriched to 60% purity. It has the technical infrastructure, according to the IAEA, to enrich that material to weapons grade on short notice. The U.S. is demanding that Iran surrender this stockpile and halt enrichment entirely for 12 years. Iran is calling enrichment a non-negotiable sovereign right. Trump threatened on April 7th that a whole civilization will die tonight, never to be brought back, if Iran did not comply. He has also stated that if there is no ceasefire, the world will see, in his words, one big glow coming out of Iran. These are not diplomatic statements. These are nuclear-adjacent threats issued by the President of the United States in the context of active military operations. Let us bring this back to what it means for the world, because that is the lens through which Global Faultlines analyses every conflict. Before February 28, 2026, the Strait of Hormuz carried more than 20 million barrels of oil per day. It served as the exit point for the energy that powers the manufacturing of South Korea, the factories of Japan, the electricity of India, and the supply chains of virtually every Asian economy. It carried 25% of the world's liquefied natural gas, the fuel that heats homes and generates electricity across Europe and Asia. All of that is now disrupted. Oil at the physical delivery level is trading at $132 per barrel. Global food prices are rising because fertilizer production is energy intensive and energy costs have surged. Global inflation is running more than 2 percentage points higher than it would otherwise be. The world's most energy-dependent developing nations, in sub-Saharan Africa, South Asia, the Middle East, are absorbing shocks that their economies were not built to withstand. The IEA has stated clearly that reopening the Strait of Hormuz is, quote, the single most important variable in easing the pressure on energy supplies, prices, and the global economy. And yet, as of this recording, the strait remains effectively closed. Iranian forces are still contesting passage. American warships are still enforcing a blockade. Oil tankers are being fired upon. Naval vessels are exchanging missiles, drones, and gunfire. And a 14-point peace proposal is sitting on a table in Tehran, waiting for an answer from a government that no longer has a confirmed supreme leader. Here is the strategic picture that Global Faultlines offers you. This conflict is being described by the Trump administration as essentially resolved, a war that is pretty much over, in the president's words. The military evidence on the ground tells a different story. Active exchanges of fire in the strait, oil tankers being disabled, 3 U.S. Navy destroyers targeted with missiles and drones, 13 Iranian airports and strategic sites struck by U.S. forces, a naval blockade that Iran's foreign minister has called an act of war, while both sides claim to be observing a ceasefire. The geopolitical evidence tells a third story. Russia is advising Iran's military. China is mediating. The European Union is distancing itself from Washington's approach. The global economy is absorbing a multi-trillion-dollar shock. And a leadership vacuum in Tehran is creating exactly the kind of uncertainty in which miscalculation becomes most dangerous. None of these 3 stories, the military story, the diplomatic story, the economic story, can be understood in isolation from the others. And none of them can be reduced to a headline. The Strait of Hormuz is 33 kilometers wide, but the stakes running through it are measured in trillions of dollars, in barrels of oil, in the price of food in countries that had nothing to do with starting this war, and in the nuclear calculations of a regime that has just lost its leader and is still deciding whether to negotiate or to escalate. That is what Global Faultlines is here to show you. If today's analysis gave you a clearer picture of what is actually at stake, share it, subscribe, and come back, because the fault lines in this one are deeper than anyone is telling you. This is Global Faultlines. See beyond the headlines.